Hi, girly pop. Hey, girly pops. So I have can't speak. I've got some spare time. So I figured, since my For You page keeps showing me all of these fucking snakes and songbirds, I gotta reread it. I got to. I don't remember good chunks of the plot. I really truly don't. So we're gonna read and see where my memory begins and ends. I just remember not falling for President Snow, because that's who this book's about. It's about President Snow, in case you didn't know. And all I can think about this entire time is, like, no matter how much they're like, he's young, he looks like a young Victor Vale, like, you know, the white hair and, like, the academics. All I can think about are how his eyes are like snakes, and I don't fuck with snakes. The cover even reminds me, he's a snake. He's a no-good snake. I'm terrified of snakes. I cannot support. Tigress, on the other hand, I will and I can support her forever. Although it is a little strange that she really be eating, trying to eat cat food. I can't be good for you, girl. Can't be good for you. However, Hunter Schaffar, she's gonna kill it. She's gonna eat it up. No crumbs. I know it. I guarantee it. I see it. I want it. I know it. She's gonna do amazing. She's just gonna do amazing. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. I don't know any of the other actors, I'm not gonna lie. I also haven't been paying the most attention to the actors, although I do know the Book Talk girlies. They're gonna get on President Snow's dick. They're not getting off. I know it. I see it. But anyway, we're gonna ignore that. We're gonna read it. I'm gonna try to. Now, if I did read this before reading The Hunger Games and before knowing, like, oh my god, what does he become? I think I would definitely be like, he's a victim. But because I know what he does, for me, I cannot forget. Like, the North remembers type shit. Like, I know what you did. I know what you're capable of. Although I do really... Okay, we're gonna start before I spoil things, in case anyone hasn't read this. Cornelius released the fistful of cabbage into the pot of boiling water and swore that one day it would never pass his lips again. But this was not that day. He needed to eat a large bowl of the anemic stuff and drink every drop of broth to prevent his stomach from growling during the reaping ceremony. It was one of a long list of precautions he took to mask the fact that his family, despite residing in the penthouse of the capital's most opulent apartment building, was as poor as district scum. That at 18, the heir to the once great House of Snow had nothing to live on but his wits. His shirt for the reaping was worrying him. He had an acceptable pair of dark dress pants, bought on the black market last year, but the shirt was what people looked at. Fortunately, the Academy provided the uniforms he required for daily use. For today's ceremony, however, students were instructed to be dressed fashionably, but with the solemnity the occasion dictated. Tigress had said to trust her, and he did. Only his cousin's cleverness with a needle had saved him so far. Still, he couldn't expect miracles. The shirt they'd dug from the back of the wardrobe, his father's from better days, was stained and yellowed with age. Half the buttons missing, a cigarette burn on one cuff, too damaged to sell in even the worst of times. And this was to be his reaping shirt? This morning he had gone to her room at daybreak, only to find both his cousin and the shirt missing. Not a good sign. Had Tigress given up on the old thing and braved the black market in some last-ditch effort to find him proper clothing? And what on earth would she possess worth offering for it? Only one thing. Herself. And the House of Snow had not yet fallen that far. But was it falling now as he salted the cabbage? He thought of people putting a price on her, with her long, pointed nose and skinny body. Tigress was no great beauty, but she had a sweetness, a vulnerability that invited abuse. She would find takers if she had a mind to. The idea made him feel sick. and helpless, and consequently disgusted with himself. From deep in the apartment he heard the recording of the capital anthem, Gem of Panem, kick on. His grandmother's soprano voice joined in, bouncing off the walls. Gem of Panem, mighty city, through the ages you shine anew. I don't know how to sing. I'm just like, I lie. As always, she was painfully off key. Oh, so I sang it wrong. Well, I don't know how to be on. I might have perfected the old lady singing. And slightly behind the tempo. The first year of the war, she'd played the recording on national holidays for 5-year-olds. Cornelius and 8-year-old Tigris in order to build their sense of patriotism. The daily recital hadn't begun until the Black Day, when the district rebels had surrounded the capital, cutting it off from supplies for the remaining 2 years of the war. Remember, children, she'd say, we are but besieged. We have not surrendered. Then she would warble the anthem out of the penthouse window as the bombs rained down, her small act of defiance. We humbly kneel to your ideal, and the notes she could never quite hit, and pledge your love to you. I don't know what this voice is. Cornelius winced a little. For a decade now, though the rebels had been silent, his grandmother had not. There was still 2 verses to go. Gem of Panem, heart of justice, wisdom crowns your marble brow. He wondered if more furniture might absorb some of the sound, but the question was academic. At present, their penthouse was a microcosm of the capital itself, bearing the scars of the relentless rebel attacks. The 20-foot-high walls were veined with cracks, the molding ceiling was dotted with holes from missing chunks of plaster, and ugly black strips of electrical tape held in place the broken glass of the arched windows that looked over the city. Throughout the war, the decade that followed, the family had forced to sell or trade many of its possessions so that some rooms were entirely empty and closed off, and the others sparsely furnished at best. Even worse, during the bitter cold of the siege's final winter, several elegant carved wooden pieces and innumerable volumes of books had been sacrificed to the fireplace to keep the family from freezing to death. Watching the bright pages of his picture books, the very ones he'd pored over with his mother, reduced to ashes, had never failed to bring him to tears. But better off sad than dead. Having been in his friends' apartments, Cornelius knew that most families had begun to repair their homes. But the Snows could not even afford a few yards of linen for a new shirt. He thought of his classmates, riffling through their closets or slipping into their newly tailored suits, and wondered just how long he could keep up appearances. You give us light, you reunite, to you we make our vow. If Tigris' revamped shirt was unwearable, what was he to do? Fake the flu and call in sick? Spineless. Soldier through in his uniform shirt? Disrespectful. Squeeze into a red button-down that he had outgrown 2 years ago? Poor. Acceptable option? None of the above. Perhaps Tigris had gone to ask help from her employer, Vambricia, what not. A woman as ridiculous as her name, oh okay, but with a certain talent for derivative fashion. Whether the trend was feathers or leathers, plastics or plush, she could find a way to incorporate it at a reasonable rate. Not much of a student. Tigris had foregone university when she graduated the academy to pursue her dream of becoming a designer. She was supposed to be an apprentice, although Fabricia used her more as a slave labor, requiring her to give foot massages and clean clumps of her long magenta hair from the drains. But Tigris never complained, and would hear no criticism of her boss. So pleased and grateful was she to have a position in fashion. Drum of Panem, seat of power, strength in peacetime, shield in strife. Cornelius opened the refrigerator, hoping for something to liven up the cabbage soup. The sole occupant was a metal saucepan. When he removed the lid, a mush of congealed, shredded potatoes stared back at him. Had his grandmother finally made good for her threat of learning to cook? Was the stuff even edible? He replaced the lid until he had more information to work with. What a luxury would be to toss it in the trash without a second thought. What a luxury trash would be. He remembered, or thought he did, being very small and watching garbage trucks operated by A-boxes. Tongueless workers made the best workers, or so his grandmother said. coming down the streets emptying large bins of discarded food, containers worn, household items. Then came the time when nothing was disposable, no calorie unwanted, and no item unable to be traded or burned for heat, or tucked against a wall for insulation. Everyone had learned to despise waste. Methinks it ain't gonna last long. It was creeping back into fashion, though, a sign of prosperity, like a decent shirt. Protect our land with armored hand. The shirt. His mind could fixate on a problem like that, anything really, and not let go, as if controlling one element of his world would keep him from ruin. It was a bad habit that blinded him to other things that could harm him. A tendency toward obsession was hardwired into his brain and would likely be his undoing if he couldn't learn to outsmart it. His grandmother's voice squeaked out the final crescendo. A capital of life. Crazy old woman, still clinging to the pre-war days. He loved her, but she'd lost touch with the reality years ago. Every meal she'd rattle on about the snow's legendary grandeur, even when their fare consisted of watery bean soup and stale crackers. And to hear her tell it was given that his future would be glorious. When Cornelius is president, she often began. When Cornelius is president, everything from the rickety Capitol Air Force to the exorbitant price of pork chops would be magically corrected. Thank goodness the broken elevator and her arthritic knees prevented her from going out much, and her infrequent visitors were as fossilized as she. The cabbage began to boil, filling the kitchen with the smell of poverty. Cornelius jabbed at it with a wooden spoon. Still no tigress. Soon it would be too late to call and make an excuse. Everyone would have assembled at the Academy's Havensby Hall. There would be anger to deal with as well as disappointment from his communications professor, Satria Click, who had campaigned for him to receive one of the 24 coveted mentorships in the Hunger Games. Besides being Satria's favorite, he was her teaching aide, and doubtless she would need him for something today. She could be unpredictable, especially when she's been drinking, and that was a given on the day of the reaping. He better call and warn her, say he couldn't stop vomiting or something, but would do his best to recover. He steeled himself and picked up the phone to plead dire illness, when another thought hit him. If he failed to show, would she allow them to replace him as a mentor? And if she did, would that weaken his chance for one of the Academy prizes presented at graduation? Without such a prize, he had no way to afford to go to university, which meant no career, which meant no future. Not for him, and who knew what would happen to his family, and the front door warped and complaining scraped open. "Corio!" Tigress cried out, and he slammed the phone down. The nickname she'd given him when he was a newborn had stuck. He flew out of the kitchen, almost knocking her over, but she was too excited to reproach him. I did it. Well, I did something." Her feet did a rapid little run in place as she held up a hanger draped in an old dress bag. Look. Cornelius unzipped the bag and stripped it from the shirt. It was gorgeous. No, even better, it was classy. The thick linen was neither the original white nor the yellow of age, but a delicious cream. The cuffs and collar had been replaced with black velvet, and the buttons were gold and ebony cubes, tesserae. Each had 2 tiny holes drilled through it for the thread. "You're brilliant," he said in earnesty. "And the best cousin ever." Careful to hold the shirt out of harm's way, he tugged her with his free arm. "Snow lands on top." "Snow lands on top," Tigress crowed. It was the saying that had gotten them through the war. One was a constant struggle not to be ground into the earth. "Tell me everything," he said, knowing she would want to. She so loved to talk clothes. She's so passionate. Tigress threw up her hands and gave a breathy laugh. Where to begin? She began with the bleach. Tigress suggested the white curtains in Fabricia's bedroom looked dingy, and while soaking them in bleach water had slipped in the shirt. It had responded beautifully, but no amount of soaking could entirely erase the stains, so she boiled the shirt with dead marigolds she'd found in the bin outside Fabricia's neighbors, and the blossoms had dyed the linen just enough to conceal the stains. The velvet for the cuffs was from a large drawstring pouch that had held some now meaningless fleck of the grandfather's. The tesserae she had pried from the interior of the cabinet in the maid's bathroom. She'd gotten the building maintenance man to drill the holes in exchange for mending his coveralls. "Was that this morning?" he asked. "Oh, no, yesterday. Sunday. This morning? Did you find my potatoes?" He followed her into the kitchen where she opened the refrigerator and pulled out the pan. I I was up until all hours making starch for them. Then I ran down to the Doolittle's so I could have a proper iron. Saved these for the soup. Tigress opened the mess in the boiling cabbage and stirred it around. He noticed the lilac circles under her golden brown eyes and couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. When was the last time you slept? He asked. Oh, I'm fine. I ate the potato skins. They say that's where the vitamins are anyway, and today's the reaping, so it's practically a holiday, she said cheerfully. Not at Fabrica's, he said. Not anywhere, really. Reaping Day was a terrible in the districts, but not much of a celebration in the capital either. Like him, most people took no pleasure in remembering the war. Tigress would spend the day waiting hand and foot on her employer and her motley crew of guests, while they exchanged more tales of the deprivation they'd experienced during the siege and drank themselves senseless. Tomorrow, nursing them through hangovers would be worse. Stop worrying. Here, you better hurry up and eat. Tigress ladled some soup into a bowl and set it on the table. Cornelius glanced at the clock, gulped down the soup without caring that it burned his mouth, and ran to his room with the shirt. He had already showered and shaved, and his fair skin was thankfully blemish-free today. The school-issued underwear and black socks were fine. He pulled on the dress pants, which were more than acceptable, and crammed his feet into a pair of laced leather boots. They were too small, but he could bear it. Then he pulled the shirt on gingerly, tucked in the tails, and turned the mirror. He was not as tall as he should have been. As for so many of his generation, a poor diet had likely compromised his growth. But he was athletically trim, with an excellent posture, and the shirt emphasized the finer points of his physique. Not since he was little, when his grandmother would parade him through the streets in a purple velvet suit, had he looked so regal. He smoothed back his blonde curls as he mockingly whispered to his image, Cornelius Snow, future president of Panem, I salute you. For Tigress' sake, he made a grand entrance into the living room, extending his arms and turning into a full circle to show off the shirt. She squealed in delight and applauded. You look amazing, so handsome and fashionable. Come see him, Grandma. Grandma. It was another nickname coined by little Tigress, who found Grandma, and certainly Nana, insufficient for someone so imperial. Their grandmother appeared as a fresh-cut rose cupped lovingly in her tremorous hands. She wore a long black flowing tunic, the kind so popular before the war and so outdated as to be laughable now, and a pair of embroidery slippers with curled toes that had once been part of a costume. Strands of her thin white hair poked from the bottom of a rusty velvet turban. This was the tail end of a once lavish wardrobe. Her few decent items were saved for company, or the rare foray into the city. Here, boy, put this on. Fresh from my roof garden, she ordered. He reached for the rose, but the thorn pierced his palm in the shaky exchange. Blood welled from the wound, and he held his hand out to keep it from staining his precious shirt. His grandmother seemed perplexed. I only wanted you to look elegant, she told him. Of course you did, Grandma'am. Grandma'am? Grandma'am? That's not right. That can't be right. And so he shall. She led Cornelius into the kitchen. He reminded himself that self-control was an essential skill, and he should be grateful his grandmother provided daily opportunities to practice it. Puncture wounds never bleed long, Tigress promised him as she quickly cleaned and bandaged his hand. She snipped away at the rose, preserving a tiny bit of greenery, and pinned it to his shirt. It does look elegant. You know what her roses mean to her. Thank her. So he did. He thanked them both and sped out the door, down the 12 ornate flights of stairs through the lobby and out into the Capitol. His front door opened on the Corso, an avenue so wide that 8 chariots had comfortably ridden side by side on it in the old days when the Capitol had put on displays of military pomp for the crowds. Cornelius could remember hanging out the apartment windows as a young child, party guests bragging that they had front row seats to the parades. Then the bombers arrived, and for a long time his block was impassable. Now through the streets were finally clear, rubble still lay in piles on the sidewalks, and whole buildings were as gutted as the day they'd been struck. 10 years after the victory, and he was dodging between chunks of marble and granite as he wove his way to the academy. Sometimes Cornelius wondered if the debris had been left there to remind the citizens of what they had endured. People had short memories. They needed to navigate the rubble, peel off the grubby ration coupons, and witness the Hunger Games to keep the war fresh in their minds. Forgetting could lead to complacency, and then they'll be back at square one. As he turned onto Scholars Road, he tried to measure his pace. He wanted to arrive on time, but cool and composed, not a sweaty mess. This reaping day, like most, was shaped up to be a scorcher. But what else could you expect on July 4th? He felt grateful for the perfume of his grandmother's rose, as his warming shirt was giving off a faint scent of potatoes and dead marigolds. I don't think dead marigolds would... Well, you're saying it's dead, but, isn't that like a flower? I don't know what kind of stench, potatoes, you probably don't want to smell like potatoes. But marigolds, I feel like that's just another flower. As the finest secondary school in the capital, the academy educated the offspring of the prominent, wealthy, and influential. With over 400 students in each class, it had been possible for Tigris and Cornelius, given their family's long history at the school, to gain acceptance without much difficulty. Unlike the university, it was tuition-free and provided lunch and school supplies along with uniforms. Anyone who was anyone attended the academy, and Cornelius would need those connections as a foundation for his future. The grand staircase up to the academy could hold the entire student body, so easily accommodated the stream of officials, professors, and students headed for the reaping day festivities. Cornelius climbed it slowly, attempting a casual dignity in case he caught anyone's eye. People knew him, or at least they had known his parents and grandparents, and there was a certain standard expected of a Snow. This year, beginning his very day, he was hoping to achieve personal recognition as well. Mentoring in the Hunger Games was his final project before graduating from the academy in midsummer. If he gave an impressive performance as a mentor, with his outstanding academic record, Cornelius should be awarded a monetary prize substantial enough to cover his tuition at the university. There would be 24 tributes, 1 boy and 1 girl from each of the 12 defeated districts, drawn by a lottery to be thrown into an arena to fight to the death in the Hunger Games. It was all laid out in the Treaty of Treason that had ended the dark days of the district's rebellion, one of the many punishments borne by the rebels. As in the past, the tributes would be dumped into the Capitol Arena, a now dilapidated amphitheater that had been used for sports and entertainment events before the war, along with some weapons to murder one another. Viewing was encouraged in the Capitol, but a lot of people avoided it. How to make it more engaging was the challenge. With this in mind, for the first time, the tributes were to be assigned mentors. 24 of the Academy's best and brightest seniors had been tapped for the job. The specifics of what this entailed was still being worked out. There was talk of preparing each tribute for a personal interview, maybe some grooming for the cameras. Everyone agreed that if the Hunger Games were to continue, they needed to evolve into a more meaningful experience, and the pairing of the capital youth with the district's tributes had people intrigued. Cornelius made his way through an entry draped in black banners, down a vaulted passage, and into carnivorous Havensby Hall, where they would watch the broadcast of the reaping ceremony. He was by no means late, but the hall was already humming with faculty and students, and a number of Games officials who were not required for the opening day broadcast. Avoxes wove through the crowd with trays of Pascal, a concoction of watery wine laced with honey and herbs. It was an intoxicating version of sour stuff that had sustained the capital through the war, supposedly fending off illness. Cornelius took a goblet and swished a little of the Pascal around in his mouth, hopefully rinsing away any trace of cabbage breath. But he only allowed himself one swallow. It was stronger than most people thought, and in previous years he had seen upperclassmen make complete fools of themselves by imbibing too deeply. The world still thought Cornelius rich, but his only real currency was charm, which he spread liberally as he made his way through the crowd. Faces lit up as he gave friendly hellos to students and teachers alike, asking about family members, dropping compliments here and there. Your lecture on district retaliation haunts me. Love the bangs. How did your mother back surgery go? Well, tell her she's my hero. He traveled past the hundreds of cushioned chairs set up for the occasion and onto the dais, where Cetria was regaling a mix of academy professors and game officials with some wild story. Although he only caught the last line, Will, I said, I'm sorry about your wig, but you were the one who insisted on bringing a monkey. He dutifully joined in the laughter that followed. Oh, Cornelius, Cetera drawled as she waved him over. Here's my star pupil. He gave her the expected kiss on the cheek and registered that she was several glasses of Pascal ahead of him. Really, she needed to get her drinking under control, although the same thing could be said for half the adults he knew. Self-medication was a citywide epidemic. Still, she was amusing and not overly uptight. One of the few professors who allowed students to call them by their first names. She drew back a bit and surveyed him. Beautiful shirt. Where did you get such a thing? He looked at the shirt as if surprised by its existence and gave the shrug of a young man's limitless options. The Snows have deep closets, he said airily. I was trying for respectful yet celebratory. And so it is. What are those cunning buttons? Cetera asked, fingering one of the cubes on his cuff. Tesseract? Are they? Well, that explains why they remind me of the maid's bathroom. Cornelius responded, drawing a chuckle from her friends. This was the impression he fought to sustain, a reminder that he was the rare person who had a maid's bathroom, let alone one tiled with tesserae, tempered with a self-deprecating joke about his shirt. He nodded to Cetria. Lovely gown, it's new, isn't it? He could tell at a glance that it was the same dress she always wore to the reaping ceremony. Flourished with tufts of black feather, but she had validated his shirt, and he needed to return the favor. I had it done, especially for today, she said, embracing the question. 10th anniversary and all. Elegant, he said. All in all, they were not a bad team. His pleasure drained as he spotted the gymnasium mistress, Professor Apparina Sickle, using her muscular shoulders to maneuver her way through the crowd. Behind her was her aide, Sejanus Plinth, who was carrying the ornamental shield Professor Sickle insisted on holding for the group photo each year. It was been awarded to her at the end of the war for successfully overseeing Academy safety drills during the bombings. It was not the shield that caught Cornelius' attention, but Sejanus' outfit. A soft charcoal gray suit with a blinding white shirt offset by a paisley tie, cut to add flow to his tall, angular frame. The ensemble was stylish, brand new and smelling of money. War profiteering, to be exact. Sejanus' father was a District 2 manufacturer who had sided with the president. He had made such a fortune off munitions that he'd been able to buy his family's way into life in the capital. The Plinths now enjoyed privileges that the oldest and most powerful families had earned over generations. It was unprecedented that Sejanus' district-born boy was a student of the academy, but his father's lavish donation had allowed for much of the school's post-war reconstruction. A capital-born citizen would have expected a building to be renamed for them. Sejanus' father had only requested an education for his son. For Cornelius, the Plinths and their kind were a threat to all he held dear. The newly rich climbers in the capital were chipping away at the old order simply by virtue of their presence. It was particularly vexing because the bulk of the Snow family fortune had also been invested in munitions. But in District 13, their sprawling complex, blocks and blocks of factories and research facilities had been bombed to dust. District 13 had been nuked, and the entire area still emitted unlivable levels of radiation. The center of the capital's military manufacturing had shifted to District 2 and fallen right into Plinth's lap. When news of District 13's demise had reached the capital, Cornelius' grandmother had publicly brushed it off, saying it was fortunate that they had plenty of other assets. But they didn't. Sejanus had arrived on the school playground 10 years ago, a shy, sensitive boy cautiously surveying the other children, with a pair of soulful brown eyes much too large for his strained face. When word had gotten out that he'd come from the districts, Cornelius' first impulse had been to join his classmates' campaign to make the new kid's life a living hell. On further reflection, he'd ignored him. The other capital children took this to mean that baiting the district's brat was beneath them. Sejanus took it as decency. Neither take was quite accurate, but both reinforced the image of Cornelius as a class act. A woman of formidable stature, Professor Sickle cruised into Cetria's circle, scattering her inferiors to the four winds. "Good morning, Professor Click." "Oh, Apparina, good. You remembered your shield," said Syria, accompanying a firm handshake. "It worries me that young people forget the real meaning of the day. And Sejanus, how smart you look." Sejanus attempted a bow, sending the wayward lock of hair into his eyes. The cumbersome shield caught him in the chest. "Too smart," said Professor Sickle. "I told him if I wanted a peacock, I'd call the pet store. They should all be in their uniform," she had Cornelius. "That's not terrible. Your father's old mesh dress shirt?" "Was it?" Cornelius had no idea. A vague memory of his father in a dashing evening suit dripping in medals came to him. He decided to play out the hand. "Thank you for noticing, Professor. I had it redone so not to suggest I'd seen combat myself, but I wanted him here with me today." "Very fitting," said Professor Sickle. Then she directed her attention to Stria, and her views on the latest deployment of peacekeepers, the nation's soldiers, to District 12, where the coal miners were failing to produce their quotas. With their teachers engaged, Cornelius nodded at the shield. "Getting a workout in this morning?" Sejanus gave a wry smile. "Always an honor to be of service." "It's a fine polished job," Cornelius replied. Sejanus tensed at the implication that he was, what, a suck-up? A lackey? Cornelius let it build a moment before he diffused it. "I should know. I do all Cetria's wine goblets." Sejanus relaxed at that. "Really?" "No, not really, but only because she hasn't thought of it," said Cornelius, seesawing between disdain and camaraderie. "Professor Sickle thinks of everything. She doesn't hesitate to call me, day or night." Sejanus looked at her as if he might continue, then just sighed. "And of course, now that I'm graduating, we're moving closer to the school. Perfect timing as usual. Cornelius suddenly felt wary. "Whereabouts?" "Somewhere on the Corso. A lot of those grand places will be going out on the market soon. Owners will not be able to afford the taxes or such, my father said." "Okay, now that I'm graduating, we're moving closer to the school. Perfect timing as usual." "Okay, so they're moving close. Okay." "They don't tax properties in the capital, only in the district," said Cornelius. "It's a new law," Sejanus told him, "to get more money from rebuilding the city." Cornelius tried to tamp down the panic rising inside of him. A new law, instating a tax on his apartment. For how much? As it was, they barely eked out a living on Tigris pittance, the tiny military pension his grandmother received for her husband's service to Panem, and his own dependent benefits as a child of the slain war hero, which would cease on graduation. If they couldn't pay the taxes, would they lose the apartment? It was all they had. Selling the place would be of no help. He knew his grandmother had borrowed every cent on it she could. If they sold, there would be next to nothing left. They would have to move to some more obscure neighborhood and join the grimy ranks of everyday citizens, without status, without influence, without dignity. The disgrace would kill his grandmother. It would be kinder to toss her out the window of the penthouse. At least that would be quick. "You all right?" said Janice, spirited and puzzled. "You just went wet as a sheet." Cornelius regained his composure. "I think it's the Pascal. Turns my stomach." "Yeah," said Janice, agreed. "Ma was always forcing it down me during the war." Ma? Was Cornelius' place about to be upset by someone who referred to his mother as Ma? The cabbage and Pascal threatened to make a reappearance. He took a deep breath and forced his stomach to hang on to it. Resenting Sejanus more than he had since the well-fed district boy was the cloddish accent first, wandered up to him, clutching a bag of gumdrops. Cornelius heard a bell ringing and saw his fellow students converging at the front of the dais. "I guess it's time to assign us tributes," Sejanus said glumly. Cornelius followed him, and where a special section of chairs 6 rows by 4 had been set up for the mentors. He tried to push past the apartment crisis out of his head, to focus on the crucial task at hand. More than ever, it was essential that he excel, and to excel, he must assign a competitive tribute. He must be assigned a competitive tribute. Dean Casa Highbottom, the man credited with the creation of the Hunger Games, was overseeing the mentor program personally. He presented himself to the students with all the verve of a sleepwalker, dreamy-eyed and, as usual, doped up on morphling. His once fine physique was shrunken and draped with sagging skin. The close-clipped precision of a recent haircut and crisp suit only threw his deterioration into relief. Due to his frame as the game's inventor, he still had a tenuous hold on his position. But there were rumors that the Academy Board was losing patience. "Ho there," he slurred, waving a crumpled piece of paper over his head. "Reading the things off now?" The students hushed, trying hard to hear him above the din of the hall. "Read you a name, then who gets that one, right? So fine. District 1 boy goes to..." Dean Highbottom squinted at the paper, trying hard to focus. "Glasses," he mumbled. "Forgot them." Everyone stared at his glasses, already perched on his nose, and waited a while. His fingers found them and... here we go. "Leva Cardew." Leva pointed little face broke into a grin, and she punched the air in victory, shouting "yes" in her shrill voice. She had always been prone to gloating, as if the plum assignment was solely a reflection on her, and not on her mother running the largest bank in the capital. Cornelius felt increasing desperation as Dean Highbottom stumbled through the list, assigning each district boy and girl a mentor. After 10 years, a pattern had emerged. The better-fed, more capital-friendly districts of 1 and 2 produced more victors, with the fishing and farming tributes of 4 and 11 also being contenders. Cornelius had hoped for either a 1 or a 2, but neither was assigned to him, which was made more insulting when Sejanus scored the District 2 boy. District 4 passed without mention of his name, and his last real chance for a victor. District 11 boy was assigned to Clemencia Dovecote, a daughter of the Energy Secretary. Unlike Livia, Clemencia received news of her good fortune with tact, pushing her sheet of raven hair over her shoulders as she studiously made note of her tribute in her binder. Something was amiss when a Snow, who also happened to become one of the Academy's high honor students, had gone unrecognized. Cornelius was beginning to think that they'd forgotten him. Perhaps they were giving him some special position. When to his horror, he heard Dean Highbottom mumble, "And last but not least, District 12 girl. She belongs to Cornelius Snow." Hold on 1 second. Replenish my throat. The District 12 girl. Could there be a bigger slap in the face? District 12, the smallest district, the joke district, with its stunted, joint-swollen kids that always died in the first 5 minutes. And not only that, but the girl? Not that the girl couldn't win, but his mind and the Hunger Games were largely about brute force, and the girls were naturally smaller than the boys, and therefore a disadvantage. Cornelius had never been a particular favorite of Dean Highbottom, whom he jokingly called high as a kite bottom among his friends, but he had not expected such a public humiliation. Had the nickname gone back to him? Or was this just an acknowledgement that in the new world order the Snows were fading into insignificance? He could feel the blood burning his cheeks as he tried to remain composed. Most of the other students had risen and were chatting amongst themselves. He must join them, pretend this was of no consequence. But he seemed incapable of movement. The most he could manage was to turn his head to the right, where Sejanus still sat beside him. Cornelius opened his mouth to congratulate him, but stopped at a barely concealed misery on the other boy's face. "What is it?" he asked. "Aren't you happy? District 2. The boy. That's the pick of the litter. You forget. I'm part of that litter, said Sejanus hoarsely. Cornelius let that sink in. So 10 years in the capital and the privileged life it provided hadn't been wasted on Sejanus? He still thought of himself as a district citizen? Sentimental nonsense. Sejanus' forehead creased in concentration. I'm sure my father requested it. He's always trying to get my mind right. No doubt, thought Cornelius. Old Strabo Plint's deep pockets and influence were respected if his lineage was not, and while the mentorships were supposedly based on merit, strings clearly had been pulled. The audience had settled into seats now. At the back of the dais, curtains parted to reveal a floor-to-ceiling screen. The reapings aired live from each district, moving from the east coast to the west. And the broadcast around the country, that meant District 12 would kick off the day. Everyone rose to the seal of Panem, filled the screens, accompanied by the capital's anthem. Gem of Panem, mighty city through the ages, you shine anew. Some of the students fumbled for the words, but Cornelius, who had heard his grandmother butcher it daily for years, sang all 3 verses in a forceful voice, garnering a few nods of approval. It was pathetic, but he needed every drop of approval he could get. The seal dissolved to show President Ravenstill, his hair streaked with silver, dressed in his pre-war military uniform as a reminder that he'd been controlling the districts long before the dark days of the rebellion. He recited a brief passage from the Treaty of Treason, which laid out the Hunger Games as a war reparation. Young districts' lives taken from the young capital lives that had been lost. The price of the rebels' treachery. The game makers cut to the bleak square of District 12, where a temporary stage now lined with peacekeepers had been erected. Before the Justice Building, Mayor Lip, a squat, freckled man in a hopelessly outdated suit, stood between 2 burlap sacks, dug his hand deeply in the bag on his left, pulling out a slip of paper, and barely glanced at it. The District 12 girl tribute is Lucy Gray Bard, he said into a mic. The camera swept over the crowd of gray, hungry faces in a gray, sleepless clothing seeking the tribute. It zoomed in towards the disturbance. Girls drawing back from the unfortunate chosen one. The audience gave a surprised murmur at the sight of her. Lucy Gray Bard stood upright in a dress made of rainbow ruffles, now raggedy, but once fancy. Her dark curly hair were pulled up and woven with limp wildflowers. Her colorful ensemble drew the eye as a tattered butterfly in a field of moths. She did not make straight for the stage, but began to weave through the girls off to her right. It happened quickly, the tip of her hand to the ruffles as her hip, the wriggle of bright green transported from her pocket and deposited down the collar of a smirking redhead's blouse. The rustle of her skirt as she moved, focus stayed on the victim, her smirk changing to an expression of horror, her shrieks as she fell to the ground, pawing at her clothes. The shouts of the mayor and in the background her assailant were still weaving, still guiding her way to the stage, not looking back even once. Heavensby Hall came to life as people elbowed their neighbor. Did you see that? But she dropped down her dress. A lizard? I saw a snake. Did she kill her? Cornelius scanned the crowd and felt a spark of hope. His long shot of a tribute, his throwaway, his insult had captured the capital's attention. This was good, right? With his help, perhaps she could keep it, and he could turn disgrace into a respectable showing. One way or another, their fates were irrevocably linked. Up on the screen, Mayor Lip flew down the steps of the stage, pushing away from the assembled girls to reach the fallen one on the ground. Mayfair, Mayfair, he cried, my daughter needs help. A circle had opened up around her, but a few half-hearted attempts to help her were blocked by her thrashing limbs. The mayor broke into the clearing just as small, iridescent green snake shot out of the folds of her dress and into the crowd, bringing screams and scrambles to avoid it. The departure of the snake calmed Mayfair, but her distress was immediately replaced by embarrassment. She looked straight into the cameras as she realized all of the citizens in Panem were watching. One hand tried to straighten a bow that had gone askew in her hair. The other moved to right her garments, filthy with the coal dust that coated everything and torn from her clawing. As her father helped to her feet, it was apparent she had wet herself. He removed his jacket to wrap around her and handed her over to Peacekeeper to lead away. He turned back to the stage and trained a murderous look on the District 12's newest tribute. As Cornelius watched Lucy Gray Bard take the stage, he felt a stab of uneasiness. Could she be mentally unstable? There was something vaguely familiar but disturbing about her. The rows of raspberry pink, royal blue, and daffodil yellow ruffles. She's like a circus performer, one of the girls remarked. The other mentors made sounds of agreement. That was it. Cornelius reached back into his memory to the circus of his earliest childhood, jugglers and acrobats, clowns and dancing girls in puffy dresses, whirling around while his brain grew giddy with spun sugar. His tributes choosing such festive attire for the darkest event of the year showed a strangeness beyond a simple lapse of judgment. The allotted time for District 12's reaping had no doubt come and gone, but they still lacked a male tribute. Even so, when Mayor Lip retook the stage, he ignored the bags of names, made a beeline for the girl tribute, and struck her in the face so powerfully that she was knocked to her knees. He had raised his hands to hit her again when a couple of peacekeepers intervened, grabbing his arms and attempting to redirect him to business at hand. When he resisted, they hauled him back into the Justice Building, bringing the whole proceeding to a standby. Attention shifted to the girl on stage as the camera zoomed in on her. Cornelius was not reassured about Lucy Gray's sanity. Where she'd gotten the makeup, he had no idea, for it was only just becoming accessible again in the capital, but her eyes shadowed blue and lined with black. Her cheeks rogued and her lips stained a somewhat greasy red. Here in the capital it would have been bold. In District 12 it felt immoderate. She was impossible to look away from. She sat there, running her hands through her skirt, compulsively smoothing the ruffles. Only when they were neatly arranged did she raise her hand to touch the mark on her cheek. Her lower lip trembled slightly, and her eyes shone with tears that threatened to spill over. "Don't cry," Cornelius whispered. He caught himself and looked around nervously to find that the other students were riveted. Their faces showed concern. She had won their sympathy despite her oddness. They had no idea who she was or why she had attacked Mayfair, but who couldn't see that the smirking thing was spiteful, and her father a brute who would flatten a girl he'd just sentenced to death. "I bet they rig it," Janice said quietly. "Her name wasn't on that slip." Just as the girl was about to lose her battle with the tears, a strange thing happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice began to sing. A young voice, which it might belong to either a boy or a girl, but of such a pitch that it carried across the silent square. "You can't take my past. You can't take my history." A puff of wind blew across the stage and the girl slowly lifted her head. Somewhere else in the crowd, a deeper, distinctively male voice sang, "You could take my pa, but his name's a mystery." The shadow of a smile played on Lucy Gray Bard's lips. She suddenly pushed herself to her feet, strode to the center of the stage, grabbing the mic and let loose. "Nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping." Her free hand dug into the ruffles of her skirt, swishing it side to side, and all of it begun to make sense. The costume, the makeup, her hair, whoever she was, she had been dressed for performance. All along she had a fine voice, and bright and clear on the high notes, husky and rich on the low, and she moved with assurance. "You can't take my charm, you can't take my humor, you can't take my wealth, 'cause it's just a rumor. Nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping." Singing transformed her, and Cornelius no longer found her so disconcerting. There was something exciting, even attractive about her. The camera drank her in as she crossed the front of the stage and leaned out into the audience, sweet and insolent. "Thinking you're so fine, thinking you can have mine, thinking you're in control, thinking you'll change me, maybe rearrange me, think again. That's your goal, 'cause..." And then she was off, sashaying around the stage, right past the peacekeepers, some of whom were having trouble suppressing smiles. None of them moved to stop her. "You can't take my sass, you can't take my talking, you can kiss my ass, and then keep on walking. Nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping." The doors to the Justice Building banged open, and the peacekeepers who had taken the mayor off burst back into the stage. The girl was facing the front, but you could see her register at their arrival. She headed to the far end of the stage for her big finish. "No, sir, nothing you can take from me is worth dirt. Take it 'cause I'd give it free. It won't hurt. Nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping." She managed to blow a kiss before they were on her. "My friends call me Lucy Gray. I hope you will too," she called out. One of the peacekeepers wrestled the mic from her hand, and another picked her up and carried her back to the middle of the stage. She waited as if to raucous applause, not dead silence. For a few moments they were silent in Heaven's B Hall as well. Cornelius wondered if, like him, they were hoping she'd keep singing. Then everybody broke out talking, first about the girl, then about who'd been lucky enough to get her. The other students were craning their heads around, some giving him a thumbs up, some shooting resentful looks. He gave a bemused shake of his head, but instead he was glowing. But inside he was glowing. Snow lands on top. Peacekeepers brought the mayor back out and planted themselves on either side of him to avoid further conflict. Lucy Gray ignored his return, having seemingly regained her poise by performing. The mayor glowered at the camera as he slapped his hand onto the second bag and pulled several slips out. A few fluttered down to the stage, and he read the remaining paper. "The District 12 boy tribute, Jessup Diggs." The kids in the square stirred and made way for Jessup, a boy with a fringe of black hair plastered down the prominent forehead. As District 12 tributes went, he was a fine specimen. Bigger than average and strong-looking, his griminess suggested he was already employed in the mines. A half-hearted attempt to washing had revealed a relatively clean oval in the middle of his face, but it was ringed with black, and coal dust caked his nails. Awkwardly, he ascended the stairs to take his place. As he neared the mayor, Lucy Gray stepped forward and extended her hand. The boy hesitated, then reached out and shook. Lucy Gray crossed in front of him, switched her right hand from her left, and they were standing side by side, holding hands, when she made a deep curtsy, pulling the boy into a bow. A smattering of applause and a lone whoop came from District 12 crowd before the peacekeepers closed in and the reaping broadcast cut to District 8. Cornelius acted engrossed in the show, as 8, 6, and 11 called their tributes, but his brain spun with the repercussions of landing Lucy Gray barred. She was a gift, he knew it, and he must treat her as such. But how best to exploit her show-stopping entrance? How to wrangle some success from a dress, a snake, a song? The tributes would be given precious little time with the audience before the games begun. How could he get the audience to invest in her, and by extension him, in just an interview? He half-registered the other tributes, mostly pitiful creatures, and took note of the stronger ones. So Janice got a towering fellow from District 2, and Livia's District 1 boy looked like he could be a contender as well. Cornelius' girl seemed fairly healthy, but her slight build was more suited to dancing than hand-to-hand combat. He bet she could run fast enough, though, and that was important. As the reaping drew to a close, the smell of food from the buffet wafted over the audience. Fresh baked bread, onions, meat. Cornelius could not keep his stomach from growling and risked another couple swallows of Pascal to quiet it. He felt wired, light-headed, and ravenous. After the screen went dark, he had used all the discipline he could muster not to rush for the buffet. The endless dance with hunger had defined his life. Not the very early years before the war, but every day since. It had been battle, a negotiation, a game. How was it best to stave off hunger? Eat all the food at one meal, spread it through the day in dribs and drabs, wolf it down, or chew every morsel to liquid. It was all just a mind game to distract himself from the fact that it was never enough. No one would ever let him have enough. During the war, the rebels held the food-producing districts, taking a page out of the capital's playbooks. They tried to starve the capital into submission using food, or a lack thereof, as a weapon. Now the tables had turned again, with the capital controlling the supply and taking it one step further, twisting the knife into the district's heart with Hunger Games. Amid the violence of the games, there was a silent agony that everyone in Panem had experienced, the desperation for enough sustenance to bring you to a following sunrise. That desperation to turn upstanding capital citizens into monsters. People who dropped dead from starvation in the streets became part of a gruesome food chain. One winter's night, Cornelius and Tigris had slipped out of the apartment to scavenge some wooden crates they spotted earlier in the alley. On the way, they passed 3 bodies, recognizing one of that of a young maid who served tea so nicely at the Crane's afternoon gatherings. A heavy, wet snow began falling, and they thought the streets deserted, but on the way home, a bundled figure sent them scurrying behind a hedge. They watched as their neighbor, Nero Price, a titan in the railroad industry, carved the leg from the maid, sawing back and forth with a terrifying knife until the limb came free. He wrapped it in the skirt he ripped from her waist, and then bolted down the side street that led to the back of his townhouse. The cousins never spoke of it, even to each other, but it was burned into Cornelius's memory. The savagery distorting Price's face, the white anklet and scuffled black shoe at the end of the severed limb, and the absolute horror of realizing that he, too, could now be viewed as edible. Cornelius credited both his literal and moral survival to the grandmama's foresight early in the war. His parents were dead, Tigris orphaned as well, and both children were living with their grandmother. The rebels had been making slow but steady progress to the capital, although arrogance kept the reality from being widely acknowledged in the city. Food shortages required even the richest to seek out certain supplies in the black market. That was how Cornelius found himself at the back door of a once trendy nightclub one late October afternoon, holding the handle of a small red wagon in one hand and the grandma's gloved hand in the other. There was a bitter chill in the air that warned ominously of winter, and a blanket of gloomy gray clouds overhead. They had come to see Pluberus Bell, an aging man with lemon-tinted spectacles and a white powdered wig that fell to his waist. He and his partner Cyrus, a musician, owned the shuttered club, and now made do by trafficking goods from the back alley. The Snows had come for a case of canned milk, the fresh stuff having disappeared weeks ago. But Pluberus said he was sold out. What had been arrived were crates of dried lima beans and stacked high on the mirror stage behind him. They'll keep for years, Pluberus promised the grandmama. I plan on setting aside 20 or so for personal use. Rena's grandmother had laughed. How ghastly. No, my dear. Ghastly's what happens without them, Pluberus said. He didn't elaborate, but Grandmama stopped laughing. She shot a look at Cornelius, and her hand clenched his for a second. It seemed involuntary, almost a spasm. Then she looked at the crates and appeared to be figuring something in her head. How many can you spare? She asked the club owner. Cornelius pulled one crate home in the wagon, and the other 29 arrived in the dead of night. As hoarding was technically illegal, Cyrus and a friend hauled the crates up to the stairs and piled them in the middle of the lavishly furnished living room. On the top of the pile, they placed a single can of milk, compliments of Pluberus, then bid them good night. Cornelius and Tiger helped the grandma hide them in closets and fancy wardrobes, even in the old clock. Who's going to eat all these, he asked. At this time, there was still bacon in his life and chicken, and the occasional roast. Milk was spotty, but cheese plentiful, and some sort of dessert could be counted on at dinner, even if it was just jam bread. We'll eat some. Perhaps we can trade some, said the grandma. They'll be our secret. I don't like lima beans, Cornelius pouted. At least, I don't think I do. Well, we'll have cook find a good recipe, said Grandma. But the cook had been called to serve in the war, then died of the flu. The grandma, it turned out, did not even know how to turn on the stove, let alone follow a recipe. It fell to 8-year-old Tigress to boil the beans in the thick stew, then the soup, then the watery broth, which was to sustain them throughout the war. Lima beans, cabbage, the ration of bread they lived on, day in, day out. Oh my god. Ugh. I still have 16 pages to go. There is this sketchy. Surely it impeded his growth. Surely he would be taller, his shoulders broader had he had more food, but his brain had developed properly. At least he hoped it had. Beans, cabbage, brown bread. Cornelius grew to hate the stuff, but it kept them alive without shame, without cannibalizing the dead bodies in the street. Cornelius swallowed the saliva flooding his mouth as he reached at the gilt-edged plate embroidered with the Academy seal. Even in the leanest days, the capital had not lacked fancy dishware, and he had eaten many a cabbage leaf from the fine china at home. He collected a linen napkin, a fork and knife, and he raised the lid to the first sterling silver chafing dish. The steam bathed his lips. Creamed onions. He took a modest spoonful and tried not to drool. Boiled potatoes, summer squash, baked ham, hot rolls, and a pat of butter. One second thought, 2 pats, a full plate, but not a greedy one, not for a teenage boy. He sat his plate on the table next to Clemencia and went to retrieve his dessert from a cart, because last year they'd run out, and he'd missed the tapioca entirely. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the rows of apple pie wedges, each decorated with a paper flag supporting the seal of Panem, pie. When had he last tasted that? He was reaching for a medium-sized piece when someone thrust a plate with an enormous slice under his nose. "Oh, take a big one. Growing boy like you can handle it." Dean Highbottom's eyes were rheumy. Rheumy. But they had lost the glazed look of the morning. In fact, they were trained on Cornelius with an unexpected sharpness. He took the plate of pie with a grin he hoped was boyishly good-natured. "Thank you, sir. I can always find room for pie." "Yes, pledges are never hard to accommodate," said the dean. "No one would know better than I." "Suppose not, sir." That sounded wrong. He had meant to agree with the part about pleasures, but it sounded like a snide remark about the dean's character. "You suppose not?" Dean Highbottom's eyes narrowed as he continued to stare at Cornelius. "So what are your plans, Cornelius, after the games?" "I hope to go on to university," he replied, with a strange question. Surely his academic record made that evident. "Yes, I saw your name among the prize contenders," said Dean Highbottom. "But you shouldn't be awarded one." "Well, then we'd pay the tuition, of course." "Would you?" Dean Highbottom laughed. "Look at you in your makeshift shirt and your too tight shoes, trying to hold it together. Strutting around the Capitol when I doubt the snows have a pot to piss in. Even with a prize, it would be a stretch. And you don't yet have one, do you? What then? I wonder. What happened to you? What then?" Cornelius could not help but glance around to see what else had heard the terrible words, but most people were engaged in mealtime chatter. "Don't worry, nobody knows. Well, hardly anyone." "Enjoy the pie, boy." Dean Highbottom walked away without bothering to take a piece himself. Cornelius wanted nothing so much as to drop his pie and run for the exit, but instead he carefully set the oversized slice back in the cart. The nickname, it could only be that the nickname, had found its way back to Dean Highbottom. Cornelius given the credit. It had been stupid on his part. The dean was too powerful a person even now to be ridiculed in public. But was it such a horrible thing? Every teacher had at least one nickname, many far less flattering. And it wasn't as if High as a Kite Bottom had made much effort to hide his habit. He seemed to invite derision. Could there be some other reason he hated Cornelius so much? Whatever it was, Cornelius needed to set it right. He could not risk losing his prize over such a thing. After university, he planned to embark on such a lucrative profession. Without an education, what doors would be open to him? Try to imagine his future in some low-level city position. Doing what? Managing the coal distribution into the districts, cleaning cages of genetic freaks in the mutation lab, collecting taxes from some Janus plinth in his palatable apartment in the Corso, while he lived in some rat hole 50 blocks out. That's if he were lucky. Capital jobs were hard to come by, and he would be penniless. Academy graduate, no more. How was he to live? Borrow? Being in debt in the capital was historically a ticket to becoming a peacekeeper, and that came with a 20-year commitment to who knew where. They'd ship him off some horrid backwater district where the people were hardly better than animals. The day which had held such promise came crashing down around him, first the threat of losing his apartment, then the lowest tribute assignment, who, on further reflection, was definitely crazy, and now the revelation that Dean Highbottom detested him enough to kill his prize chances and condemn him to a life in the districts. Everyone knew what happened if you went to the districts. You were written off, forgotten. In the eyes of the capital, you were basically dead. Cornelius stood on the bottom empty train platform awaiting his tribute's arrival. A long-stemmed white rose balanced carefully between his thumb and index finger. It had been Tigress' idea to bring her a gift. She had arrived home very late in the night of the reaping, but he had waited up to consult with her to tell her of his humiliations and fears. She refused to let the conversation spin into despair. He would get a prize. He would have to. And have a brilliant university career. As to the apartment, they must find out the specifics first. Perhaps the tax would not affect them, or even if it did, maybe not soon. Maybe they could scrape up enough for the taxes somehow. But he was to think of none of that, only of the Hunger Games, and how he might make a success out of it. At Fabricia's reaping party, Tigress said everyone was nuts about Lucy Graybard. His tribute had star quality, her friends had declared as they drunkenly slurped their pasca. The cousins agreed that he needed to make a good first impression of the girl, so that she would be willing to work with him. He should treat her not as a condemned prisoner, but as a guest. Cornelius had decided to greet her early in the train station. It would give him a jump on the assignment, as well as an opportunity to win her trust. Imagine how terrified she must be, Coro, Tigress had said. How alone she must feel. If it was me, anything you could do to make me feel like you cared about me would go a long way. No more than that, like I was of value. Take her something, even if it's a token that lets her know you value her. Cornelius thought about his grandmother's roses, which was still prized in the capital. The old woman's nurtured them in the roof garden that came with the penthouse, both out of the doors and in the small solar greenhouse. She parceled out her flowers like diamonds, though, so it had taken a good bit of persuasion to get this beauty. I need to make a connection with her. As you always say, your roses open any doors. It was a testament to how worried his grandmother was about their situation that she had allowed it. 2 days had passed since the reaping. The city had held on to the oppressive heat, and even though it was just past dawn, the train station was beginning to bake. Cornelius felt conspicuous on the wide, deserted platform, but he couldn't risk missing her train. The only information he could get out of his downstairs neighbor, game maker in training Remus Doolittle, was that it was supposed to arrive Wednesday. Remus had recently graduated from university, and his family had pulled in every favor they had to get him the position, which paid just enough and provided a stepping stone to the future. Cornelius could have inquired through the academy, but he didn't know if greeting the train would be frowned upon. No rules had been laid out per se, but he thought most of his classmates would wait to meet their tributes as a session overseen by the academy the following day. An hour passed, then 2, and still no train of any kind appeared. The sun beat down through the glass panes of the station ceiling. Perspiration trickled down his back, and the rose, so majestic that morning, began to bend in resignation. He wondered if the whole idea was ill-conceived, and if he would get no thanks for greeting her in the way. Another girl, a typical girl, would be impressed, but there was nothing typical about Lucy Graybard. In fact, there was something intimidating about a girl who could pull such a brazen performance on the heels of the mayor's assault. And then, there was something in that, just after she had dropped a venomous snake down another girl's dress. Of course, he didn't know that it was venomous. But that was where the mind went, wasn't it? She was terrifying, really. And here he was in his uniform, clutching a rose like some love-struck schoolboy, hoping she would, like him? Trust him? Not kill him on sight? Her cooperation was imperative. Yesterday, Cetria had led a mentor meeting in which their first assignment had been detailed. In the past, the tributes had gone directly into the arena, the morning after they'd all arrived in the capital, but the timeline had been extended now that the academy students were involved. It had been decided that each mentor was to interview their tribute and would be given 5 minutes to present them to Panem on a live television program. If people had someone to root for, they might actually have an interest in watching the Hunger Games. If all went well, it would be a prime-time viewing. The mentors might even be invited to comment on their tributes during the games. Cornelius promised himself that his 5 minutes would be the standout of the night. Another hour crawled by, and he was just about ready to give up when a train whistle sounded deep in the tunnel. Those first few months of the war, the whistle had signaled his father's arrival from the battlefield. His father had left, and that as a munitions tycoon. Military service enhanced his legitimacy in the family business. With an excellent head for strategy, nerves of steel, and a commanding presence, he quickly climbed the ranks to publicly display their commitment to the capital cause. The Snow family would all travel to the station, Cornelius in his velvet suit to await the great man's return. Okay, so I'm trying to think legitimately of, if I was in this, how would I react? Well, probably, first of all, I'd be like, this is kind of fucked up, because, like, It is, especially if I was in the districts or even like in this time frame, it would still be like, this is kind of weird. What the fuck? And then like the interviews, they add on another purpose of like where it reminds me of Playground, where it's just like we're just watching them and they're probably gonna die. Like it's not like, it's kind of like, it's not like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where it's like, oh, they come kind of close to like maybe dying, but they live at the end and we see them. I have too much empathy. Until the day the train brought only the news that a rebel bullet had found its mark. It was hard in the capital to find a spot that wasn't linked to a terrible memory, but this was particularly bad. He could not say he had felt great love for the remote, strict man, but he had certainly felt protected by him. His death was associated with a fear and a vulnerability that Cornelius had never been able to shake off. The whistle blew as the train sped into the station and screeched to a halt. It was a short train, only an engine and 2 cars. Cornelius looked for a glimpse of his tribute in the windows before he realized the cars had none. They were designed not for passengers but for cargo. Heavy metal chains attached by old-fashioned padlocks secured the goods. The wrong train, he thought. Might as well go home. But then a distinctively human cry came from one of the cargo cars, and he remained in place. He expected a rush of peacekeepers, but the train sat ignored for 20 minutes before a few made their way to the rails. One of them exchanged word with an unseen engineer, and a set of keys were tossed out the window. The peacekeeper took his time, meandering down to the first car, flipping through the keys before he selected one, stuck it in the padlock, and gave it a twist. The lock and chains fell away, and he rolled back the heavy door. The car appeared empty. The peacekeeper pulled on his baton and banged it against the doorframe. "All right, you lot, let's move." A tall boy with dark brown skin and patched burlap clothing appeared in the doorway. Cornelius recognized him as Clementine's tribute from District 11. Rangy, but muscular. A girl with similar coloring but a skeletal frame and hacking cough joined him. Both of them were barefoot with their hands cupped in front of their bodies. It was a 5-foot drop to the ground, so they sat on the edge of the car before launching themselves awkwardly onto the platform. A small, pasty-faced girl in a striped dress and red scarf crawled to the door but seemed unable to figure out how to cover the distance to the ground. Peacekeeper yanked her down and she landed hard, barely catching herself with her bound hands. Then he reached into the car and dragged out a boy who was about 10 years old but had to be at least 12 and hauled him onto the platform as well. By now the smell of the car, musty and heavy with manure, had reached Cornelius. They were transporting the tributes in livestock cars, and not very clean ones at that. He wondered if they'd been fed and let out for fresh air, or just locked in after their reapings. Accustomed as he was to viewing the tributes on screen, he had not prepped himself properly for this encounter in the flesh, and a wave of pity and revulsion swept through him. They really were creatures out of another world, a hopeless, brutish world. The peacekeepers moved onto the second car and released the chains. The door slid open and revealing Jessup, the male tribute, squinting into the brightly lit station. Cornelius felt a jolt run through him, and his body straightened in anticipation. Surely she would be with him. Jessup hopped stiffly to the ground and turned back to the train. Lucy Gray Bard stepped into the light, her cuffed hands half covering her eyes as they adjusted. Jessup reached up his arms to his wrists, spread as wide as the chain on his restraints would allow, and she fell forward, letting him catch her by the waist and swing her to the ground in a surprisingly graceful movement. She patted the boy's sleeve in thanks and tilted her head back to drink in the sunlight streaming into the station. Her fingers began to combing through her curls, untangling the knots and picking out bits of straw. Cornelius' attention turned for a moment to the peacekeepers, who were hollering threats into the train car. When he gazed back, Lucy Gray was staring directly at him. He startled a bit, but then remembered that he was the only one on the platform besides the peacekeepers. The soldiers were cursing now as they hoisted one of their number into the train car to retrieve the reluctant tributes. It was now or never. He crossed to Lucy Gray, extending the rose, and gave a small nod. "Welcome to the capital," he said. His voice was slightly gravelly, as he had not spoken for hours, but he thought it gave him a nice maturity. The girl sized him up, and for a minute he feared she was going to either walk away or worse, laugh at him. Instead, she reached out and delicately plucked the petal from the flower in his hand. "When I was a little, they used to bathe me in buttermilk and rose petals," she said in a manner that, despite the unlikeliness of her claim, seemed totally believable. She ran her thumb over the glossy white surface and slipped the petal into her mouth, closing her eyes to savor the flavor. "Tastes like bedtime." Cornelius took the moment to examine her. She looked different than she had in the reaping. Except for flecks here and there, the makeup had been wiped away, and without it, she appeared younger. Her lips were chapped, her hair loose, her rainbow dress dusty and rumpled. The mark from the mayor's blow had turned into a deep purple bruise. But there was something else too. He again had the impression he was witnessing a performance, but a private one this time. You got it over. When she opened her eyes, she trained all her attention on him. You don't look like you should be here. Probably shouldn't be, he admitted. But I'm your mentor, and I wanted to meet you on my own terms, not the game makers. Ah, a rebel, she said. That word was poison in the mouths of capital citizens, but she said it approvingly, as a compliment. Or was she mocking him? He remembered she carried snakes in her pockets, and the usual rules didn't apply to her. Snow and Katniss really do be thinking alike, where they're like, she's tricking me. This is not safe. What are you thinking? You're out to get me. In Katniss' sake, technically most people are out to get her. In Snow's sake, it's all up here. He remembered she carried... And what does my mentor do for me besides bring me roses, she asked. I do my best to take care of you, he said. She glanced over her shoulder where the peacekeepers were tossing 2 half-starved children onto the platform. The girl broke a front tooth on the platform while the boy received several sharp kicks upon landing. Lucy Gray smiled up at Cornelius. Well, good luck, gorgeous, she said. I don't care for that at all, she said, and walked back to Jessup, leaving him and his rose behind. Wait, she just, tossed it back? She just took a petal, ate it, and said, tastes like bedtime, and then fucked off? She is a manic pixie dream girl. As the peacekeepers herded the tributes across the station to the main entrance, Cornelius felt his chance slipping away. He had not secured her trust. He had not done anything except perhaps amuse her for a moment. Clearly she thought he was useless, and maybe she was right. But with all that was at stake, he had to try. He ran across the station, catching up to the pack of tributes as they reached the door. Excuse me, he said to the peacekeeper in charge. I'm Cornelius Snow from the Academy. He inclined his head towards Lucy Gray. This tribute has been assigned to me for the Hunger Games. I wonder if I might accompany her to her quarters. That's why you've been hanging around here all morning? To catch a ride to the show? Asked the peacekeeper. He reeked of liquor, and his eyes were rimmed with red. Well, by all means, Mr. Snow. Join the party. It was then that Cornelius saw the truck that awaited the tributes. Less a truck, more than a cage on wheels. The bed was enclosed by metal bars and topped with a steel roof. He again flashed back to the circus of his childhood, where he had seen wild animals, big cats and bears confined to transport. Following the orders, the tributes presented their cuff for removal and climbed into the cage. Cornelius hung back, but then saw Lucy Gray watching him and knew this was the moment of judgment. If he backed down now, it would all be over. She would think he was a coward and dismiss him entirely. He took a deep breath and hoisted himself into the cage. The door slammed shut behind him, and then the truck lurched forward, knocking him off balance. He reflexively grabbed for the bars on his right and wound up in his forehead crammed between them as a couple of tributes fell into him. He pushed back forcibly and twisted his body around to face his fellow passengers. Everyone had hold of at least one bar now, except the girl with the broken tooth, who was clinging to the leg of the boy from her district. As the truck rumbled down a wide avenue, they began to settle in. Cornelius knew he had made a mistake. Even in the open air, the stench was overwhelming. The tributes had absorbed the odor of the cattle car, and it mixed with an unwashed human smell that made him feel slightly nauseous. Up close, he could see how grubby they were, how bloodshot their eyes, how bruised their limbs. Lucy Gray was cramped in a corner at the front, dabbing a fresh scrape on her forehead with her ruffled hem. She seemed indifferent to his presence, but the rest of them stared at him like a pack of feral animals eyeing a pampered poodle. At least I'm in better condition than they are, he thought, and he made a fist around the stem of the rose. If they attack, I'll stand a chance. Would he? Against so many? Oh! I don't like this man. He is not hot. He is not attractive. Killing children? Not hot. Troy passed the truck. The truck slowed to let one of the colorful street trolleys packed with people cross in front of it. Although he was in the back, Cornelius hunched down to avoid being noticed. The trolley passed, the truck began to roll, and he dared to straighten up. They were laughing at him. The tributes, or at least some of them, were grinning at his obvious discomfort. What's the matter, pretty boy? You in the wrong cage, said the boy from District 11, who was not laughing at all. The undisguised hatred rattled Cornelius, but he tried to look unimpressed. No, this is exactly the cage I was waiting for. The boy's hands came up fast, encircling Cornelius' throat with his long, scarred fingers and slamming him back. His forearms pinned Cornelius' body against the bars. Overpowered, Cornelius resorted to the one move that he had yet to fail him in schoolyard scuffles, driving his knee up hard into his opponent's crotch. The district boy gasped and doubled over, releasing him. He might kill you now, the girl from District 11 coughed in Cornelius' face. He killed a peacekeeper back in 11. They never found out who did it. Shut it, Dill. the boy growled. Who cares now, said Dill. Let's all kill him, the tiny boy said viciously. Can't do nothing worse to us. Several other tributes murmured in agreement and took a step in. Cornelius went rigid with fear. Kill him? Did they really mean to beat him to death, right here in broad daylight in the middle of the capital? Suddenly he knew they did. What, after all, did they have to lose? His heart pounded in his chest and he crouched slightly, fist extended in anticipation of the imminent attack. From the corner, Lucy Gray's melodic voice broke the tension. Not to us, maybe you. Got family back home? Someone they could punish there? This seemed to take the wind out of the other tribute's sails. She wriggled through and placed herself between them and Cornelius. Besides, she said, he's my mentor, supposed to help me. I might need him. How come you get a mender? Asked Dill. Mentor. You each get one, explained Cornelius, trying to sound on the top of the situation. Where are they then? Dill challenged. Why didn't they come? Just not inspired, I guess, said Lucy Gray, turning from Dill. She gave Cornelius a wink. The truck veered into the narrow side street and bumped down to what appeared to be a dead end. Cornelius could not quite get his bearings. He tried to remember what the tributes had been held in previous years. Hadn't it been in the stables that housed the peacekeepers' horses? Yes, he thought. He had heard some mention of that. As soon as they arrived, he found a peacekeeper and explained things, perhaps asked for a bit of protection. Given the hostility after Lucy Gray's wink, it might be worthwhile to stay. They were backing in now in a dimly lit building, maybe a warehouse. Cornelius inhaled a musky mix of rotten fish and old hay. Confused, he tried to get a better fix of his surroundings, and his eyes strained to make out two metal doors swinging open. The peacekeeper opened the back door of the truck, and before anyone could climb out, the cage tipped and dumped them onto a slab of cold, damp cement. Not a slab, actually more like a chute, for it was tilted at such an extreme angle that Cornelius began to slide immediately, along with the rest. He dropped the roses his hands and feet scrambled for purchase, but found none. They all traveled a good 20 feet before they landed in a jumbled heap of gritty floor. Sunlight glared down on Cornelius as he scrambled to untangle his body from the pack. He staggered out a few yards, righted himself in frozen horror. This was not the stables. While he had not visited in many years, he remembered it clearly now. The stretch of sand, the artificial rock formation twisting high in the air, the row of metal bars engraved to look like vines carved in a wide arc to protect the audience. Between the sets of bars, the faces of capital children gawked at him. He was in the monkey house at the zoo. Okay, I'm going to do a real quick... So these chapters are obviously, like, much longer than Playground, because it's also, like, a much longer book, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, no, that's, like, 18 pages. So I'm going to end on page 47, and then next time we'll start with chapter 4. But I think that's a funny place to start. We're at the monkey house. I don't like them as a couple. Hold on. Wait. Uno momento. So I just retrieved this from home this weekend. And I got it at the thrift store. And I didn't know what to do with it at first. But then I started, like, gradually just, filling it in with books that I have. And as you can see, multiple colors and stickers. Now, very sloppily, I do have this little index that says, like, what each thing. So we got academic acquired, as in I got it, like, it's like a book that you would read in a school. Didn't need a love story. Crying, which real world problems, like we got, like, The Hate You Give, and I have other books, but The Hate You Give is the only one I can think of right now. What else? I know I have 4 other books, but I have no idea what they're called. Okay, we'll look for it later. We have self-help because I do have a few of those books. I have literally a tarot book where it's, like, for writing, but it's like, oh, you pick a tarot card, this is what's going to happen in your story, which I think is, like, fucking incredible. And I use it sometimes if I'm feeling a little lost for what to do, and I'm like, could this work? And then we have childhood, because I have a lot of books, like, from my childhood that, like, I reread over and over and over again. We have teen love, because teen love versus, like, regular romance is just different. And we have to accept that as a society. It's different. Embarrassing are books that I probably really like, or I'm like, I don't want to get rid of because I'll probably read them again, like, in my darkest moment. And then we have, they're so good. Think about them constantly. Examples of that, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Vicious, the Rockton novels, which are kind of embarrassing too, because everyone tells me they're shit, but I love them, so I don't give a fuck. Mythologies of Worship, so we have The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, because it's, like, this, like, deep, like, this deep lore in them. Another series, I don't own it, but I want to own it, is His Fair Assassins, where it's like, oh, you're the daughter of Death, Saint Morton, and like it's very, very rich with words. But I could also be like, because I read that series in like 2 weeks. And then Big Words. So that would probably be The Witcher and the Witcher series, and also Game of Thrones, which I am in the process of reading those, but they're so big words that like it's so difficult. And there's so many like names, I'm just going. You haven't noticed, I'm a little illiterate despite doing a lot of reading and writing. But yeah, so this is like literally this book. I have more books than like what's on here. So I have 1 page, 2, 3, not 4 pages. I have to wait until I finish reading the book, and I have a lot of books like on my bookshelf that I have not read yet. And I also need to write in the Harry Potter series, but like I just don't really feel like it right now, like because I finished it, so I can write it down. I read it a while ago, and then I'm also in the process of reading the Percy Jackson books, which I might restart because this was like 2 years ago, so I have no idea what I missed. And then look, oh my god, it's the Ballad of Snake and Songbirds. It's the book. And these count as because they're so rich. And I still cannot get over that. Literally everyone was like, oh my god, we need Finnick Odair's story. Oh my god, we need Hamish. Oh my god, we need Peter's perspective. Oh my god, we need literally every other character in the book's perspective was asked for. And we got Snow. I literally saw people like asking like about the Avox girl that like the redhead that like comforted Katniss in the first game, like asking like, oh, like what happened to her? And wanting like a little mini story of her. We didn't get her. We got Snow, which didn't know I would enjoy. I do enjoy it, don't get me wrong. I don't enjoy him is the problem. Everything else, Lucy Greybard, she's a little trickster. She's not a Songbird. She's a snake, just like him. She's a Jabberjay. But yeah, that's all. Hope you enjoyed. My throat didn't. Yeah. I'm hopefully gonna go watch Scream 2 with some people later tonight. And I also need to do some work on this paper for politics. Or I need to read the book. Fuck. Alright. Hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.